It all started on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. People came together to hear a man who spoke with a kind of authority that felt different from the religious teachers they were used to. Sitting in a boat just off the shore, Jesus looked out at the crowd gathered on the beach. He could see what each person truly desired. Some came hoping to witness wonders, others were curious to understand his message more deeply, and a few sincerely wanted to change their lives. So Jesus began to teach them, using simple, familiar stories to express deeper meanings. These stories were known as parables, tales that held more than what they first seemed to say. This was the beginning of teachings that would shape hearts for years to come. One of these stories was the parable of the sower. That day, Jesus stepped out of a house and went to sit by the sea. A large crowd gathered, so he climbed into a boat while the people stood by the water's edge. He started to speak to them using parables to teach many things. In Matthew 13:3-9, Jesus told this story. A farmer went out to scatter seeds. Some seeds landed on the path, and birds quickly came and ate them. Others landed where the ground was rocky and didn't have much soil. These seeds grew fast, but since the roots were shallow, the sun dried them up, and they died. Some seeds fell where thorn bushes were growing. As the thorns got bigger, they smothered the new plants. But some seeds landed in good soil, and they grew well, producing a harvest many times greater than what was planted. Some 100, others 60 or 30 times more. If you're listening, really pay attention, Jesus said. His followers were confused. Why didn't he just speak clearly, like the usual teachers? They came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to people using parables?" Jesus answered in Matthew 13:11-12, saying, "You've been given insight into the mysteries of heaven's kingdom, but they haven't. Those who already understand will be given more, and they'll be rich in knowledge. But those who don't, even what little they think they have, will be taken away." It was like Jesus was saying, if you truly want to understand, you'll discover more and more truth. But if you listen without care, even the little you know will fade. The farmers in the crowd easily pictured the story. A man walking through a field, tossing handfuls of seed across the land. They knew there were no machines back then. Everything was done by hand. Naturally, seeds would land on all kinds of ground. The farmer didn't seem too picky, right? Seeds fell on the path, the rocks, and among thorns. Why not only plant in the best soil? Because God's love works like this. He shares his message with everyone, giving each person the chance to receive it. Then Jesus gave the meaning behind the story in Matthew 13:18-23. Let me explain what this story about the farmer really means. When someone hears the message about God's kingdom but doesn't grasp its meaning, the devil comes quickly and takes away what was placed in their heart. That's the seed that landed on the road. The seed that fell on the rocky ground is like someone who hears the message and is thrilled right away. But since there's no deep foundation, their faith doesn't last. When problems or pressure come, because of what they believed, they quickly walk away. The seed that landed among thorns stands for someone who hears the word, but daily worries and the false promise of riches take over, and the message is pushed aside and bears no result. But the seed that fell into good earth, that's the person who hears, understands, and holds on to the word. They're the ones who grow and multiply what they received, producing a harvest of 160 or 30 times more. Jesus looked deeply into each of his followers' eyes. He wanted them to see the truth. The same message can fall on different hearts and lead to totally different results. Think of the path. It's been pressed down by feet and hooves until it's hard as stone. Seeds can't get in, so birds eat them right off the surface. Jesus was showing that this is like a heart that's been hardened. Someone hears the truth but doesn't let it in. They remain unchanged. The second type of ground had rocks just below a thin layer of soil. Seeds in that kind of soil start growing fast, but the roots can't go deep. When the sun shines hot, the plant dries up. This, Jesus said, is like people who get excited at first. This is incredible. I want to live differently. But it's only on the surface. When real challenges or criticism come because of their faith, they give up easily. The third type of soil was filled with thorny plants. The seeds did sprout, but the thorns took over and smothered them. Jesus explained that this ground represents people who hear the truth, but get caught up in daily stress and the trap of chasing money. They're too distracted by work, bills, appearances, and status. The message gets lost in the noise and doesn't grow. And then there's the last kind of soil, rich, deep, clear of stones and weeds. The seed not only grows, it flourishes and brings a huge return. Jesus said, this is the heart of someone who hears the message, really gets it, and lets it change them. And the result? A life that overflows with goodness, producing 30, 60, even 100 times more than what was first planted. Which type of ground reflects your heart? That seemed to be the question in Jesus' intense gaze. The problem wasn't with the seed, it was perfect. God's message is always powerful. Nor was the farmer to blame. What really mattered was the condition of the soil, how each person's heart accepted the message. Then Jesus moved on to another story, the parable of the weeds. After finishing the story about the sower, Jesus noticed the crowd was still listening closely, so he shared another lesson. In Matthew 13:24-30, he said, God's kingdom is like a farmer who planted good seeds in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and scattered bad seeds among the good ones, then disappeared. When the wheat began to grow and form heads, weeds popped up too. The farmer's workers came to him and asked, Sir, didn't you plant only good seed? Where did all these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy did this. The workers said, Should we go pull them out? No, the farmer replied, because while removing the weeds, you might damage the wheat too. Let them grow together until harvest time. Then I'll tell the workers, gather the weeds first, tie them in bundles, and burn them. After that, collect the wheat and store it in my barn. The crowd murmured to each other, trying to figure out what the story meant. Farmers in the group immediately recognized the kind of weeds Jesus was describing. It was darnel, a plant that looks nearly identical to wheat when it's young. Even a skilled farmer would have trouble telling them apart in the early stages. Only when the grain heads form does the difference become obvious. Wheat has golden heads full of grain. Darnel grows dark, empty spikes. Planting weeds in someone else's field was a real and harmful act back then, a way to destroy a rival's harvest and create exhausting work to sort it all out. Picture the farmer walking through his field one morning, watching the crops grow, and suddenly noticing something wasn't right. I didn't plant this, he'd think, spotting the weeds among the wheat. Naturally, the workers wanted to act fast. Those weeds were using up the nutrients, moisture, and space meant for the wheat. But the landowner understood more than they did. He knew that below the surface, the roots of wheat and weeds had tangled together. Pulling the weeds too early would rip out the wheat along with them. So it was wiser to wait for the right time, harvest, when separating them would be safer and more effective. Later on, when Jesus was alone with his disciples, they came to him and asked for the meaning of the parable about the weeds. Jesus explained in Matthew 13:37-43, The one who plants the good seed is the Son of Man. The field represents the world, and the good seed is the people who belong to God's kingdom. The weeds, Jesus explained, represent those who belong to the evil one, and the one who planted them is the devil. The harvest marks the end of time, and the harvesters are angels. Just as weeds are gathered and burned, the same will happen at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels to remove from his kingdom everything that leads to sin and all those who do wrong. These will be thrown into a fiery furnace, a place of sorrow and regret. But those who are right with God will shine brightly like the sun in their Father's kingdom. If you can understand this, Jesus said, listen carefully. His explanation was bold. Jesus was clearly saying that he himself was the one planting the good seed. And the field? It wasn't just Israel, but the whole world. The good seed didn't represent ideas, but people, those who truly followed him and belonged to God's kingdom. The weeds were also people, those who chose evil over truth. Even more shocking was the claim that the enemy who scattered the bad seeds was the devil. A spiritual war was taking place right in front of them, and Jesus made it clear this battle wouldn't end until the final day of judgment. His followers were probably amazed by this. Some of them may have been eager to fight back, ready to confront those they saw as enemies of God. Many Jews at that time believed the Messiah would defeat the nations and restore Israel's power. But what Jesus taught was very different. Don't pull up the weeds, the landowner said. Jesus was teaching his disciples not to judge or try to remove people they thought were evil. The final judgment would belong to God, who would separate the good from the bad at the right moment. Until then, both would grow side by side. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that God's kingdom wouldn't be established by force or cleansing. It wouldn't come by getting rid of all that was bad and keeping only the good. Instead, the kingdom would rise in the middle of struggle, surrounded by resistance. Good and evil would exist together, sometimes even looking alike. Jesus also gave a warning. Don't be shocked when you see wickedness succeed, even inside communities of faith. Don't lose heart when evil seems to win. In the end, God will make a perfect judgment, and those who live righteously will shine like the sun. This message called for deep trust and patience. It wasn't a quick fix. It was about letting good grow, even in hard conditions, until the time came for God to act. And now Jesus turned to another story, the parable of the mustard seed. The people were still listening closely. Jesus looked at them and saw many expecting a powerful kingdom that would crush the Roman Empire. But he needed to help them see that God's kingdom didn't work that way. In Matthew 13:31-32, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man planted in his field. It's the tiniest of seeds, yet when it grows, it becomes the biggest of garden plants, large enough for birds to nest in its branches." People looked at each other curiously. Many of them were farmers or tended small plots of land. They knew exactly what a mustard seed looked like, so small it could almost disappear in your hand. But in that region, it was known to grow rapidly into a tall shrub, reaching over 3 meters in just a matter of weeks. The contrast was powerful, something barely visible becoming something huge. Jesus may have held up a mustard seed in his palm and said, "It looks like nothing, right? But just wait until it's planted." He might have gestured toward a large mustard bush nearby, its branches home to birds. For those who expected a Messiah to arrive with warriors and victory banners, this story was unsettling. Jesus was showing that God's kingdom would start quietly, in an unexpected way, with him and a small band of ordinary people. Nothing majestic by worldly standards. There were no royal processions, no armies, no palaces. Picture the crowd eyeing the group around Jesus, a man from a small town, fishermen, tax collectors, women, and outcasts. Could this really be the kingdom of God? They likely wondered. It looked as unimportant as a mustard seed, but Jesus promised this tiny beginning would grow into something massive. The kingdom would expand and welcome people from all over, like birds settling into the branches of a great tree. It was an uplifting message for his disciples. Don't be discouraged by how small this looks now. Don't feel ashamed of how little you seem to be. What we're beginning together will reach far and wide, beyond anything you can dream of. And truly, who would have believed that a small circle of followers from Galilee would one day become a global community with billions of people? Who could have imagined the words of that carpenter spreading across nations and centuries, transforming hearts and societies? But Jesus' message was also a caution. The kingdom wouldn't arrive all at once, like a lightning bolt or sudden revolution. Instead, it would grow quietly, like a seed under the soil, slow, steady, and unstoppable. Jesus was confronting the expectations of the time. He wasn't bringing a kingdom by conquering with weapons or taking over governments. He was planting it deep within hearts, where change would begin from the inside out, transforming homes, friendships, and entire communities. This was God's way. He often works through the small, the unnoticed, the seemingly weak to carry out the most powerful plans. He chooses a seed, not a tree. He values slow, living growth over fast, forced change. Those listening might have recalled the words spoken long ago by the prophet Zechariah. Don't look down on small beginnings. God was starting something through Jesus that appeared minor, but it would grow far beyond what anyone could imagine. Then Jesus shared another story to make this even clearer, the parable of the yeast. To reinforce his message, he gave them a short but powerful illustration. In Matthew 13:33, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and worked into 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened." He used a simple, familiar image that everyone could relate to. The women in the crowd nodded. They'd done this many times, adding just a pinch of yeast to dough and watching it change everything. Imagine it now. A woman in her home, preparing bread for her loved ones. She takes a tiny bit of yeast, barely noticeable compared to the rest of the flour. She kneads it carefully into the dough and waits. At first, nothing appears to change, but slowly, in ways that can't be seen with the eye, the yeast begins to do its work. Hour by hour, the dough rises, softens, and changes completely. That small amount of yeast ends up transforming 3 measures of flour, enough to feed 100 people. The process is quiet, hidden, yet incredibly powerful. And once it begins, it can't be undone. The dough will never be the same. In the same way, Jesus taught, God's kingdom doesn't arrive through dramatic force or outward conflict. It begins in people's hearts and spreads from within, steadily changing lives and, over time, entire communities. It's striking that Jesus chose something from everyday home life, something done by women, to explain such a deep truth about how his kingdom works. While many imagined God's kingdom arriving like a mighty army, Jesus described it through the simple, careful work done in kitchens. The 3 measures of flour he mentioned, about 22 liters, could feed over 100 people. The point, even a small amount of yeast has the power to influence something far bigger than itself. Again, Jesus was going against what most people expected from the Messiah. They were waiting for dramatic displays, military victories, and political triumphs. But he was saying, no, the kingdom is like yeast. It moves quietly. It starts inside people. It spreads slowly and surely. Yeast doesn't change flour by force. It becomes part of it, working from within, changing everything from the inside. Likewise, the kingdom of God doesn't force itself on people. It transforms them, beginning in the heart. Yeast also points to influence. Just a few people living by kingdom values can leave a lasting mark on an entire society. A small group of true disciples can impact a whole city. The message was unmistakable. Never underestimate what begins small, moves quietly, and grows steadily. That day, Jesus ended his stories, leaving the people deep in thought. Matthew 13:34-35 records that Jesus spoke all these things to the crowds using parables. He didn't teach them without using stories. This fulfilled what had been foretold through the prophet. I will speak in parables and reveal things hidden since the world was made. The evening light bathed the Sea of Galilee in soft gold. People began to head home, some walking in pairs or small groups, talking about what they had heard. "What did he mean with the yeast?" someone asked. "Do you think we're the wheat or the weeds? How can I tell what kind of soil my heart is?" Others wondered aloud. Jesus looked on with a knowing smile. He understood that not everyone would grasp the meaning right away, but the seeds were in the ground. The stories he told had the power to reach deep inside people, like yeast that quietly works through dough, slowly changing the way they saw the world. That day, on the shoreline, Jesus planted truths that would grow for years to come. He showed that the kingdom of God begins as something tiny, like a mustard seed. It works quietly, like yeast hidden in flour. It grows even in the presence of opposition, like wheat among weeds. And it all depends on how open a person's heart is, just like different types of soil. These first parables laid the groundwork for all Jesus would teach next. They described a kingdom that didn't follow the world's usual ways. This kingdom valued what was small, gentle, patient, and internal, over what was loud, proud, instant, and external. It was a kingdom that started in the heart and reached outward, changing everything it touched. And then Jesus went on to share another story, the parable of the unmerciful servant. As he continued teaching, he wanted his followers to understand not just how the kingdom grows, but also how people within it should live. One day, Peter came to Jesus with a question many had probably wondered about. In Matthew 18:21, he asked, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother when he wrongs me? 7 times?" Peter likely felt he was being generous. Some Jewish teachers taught forgiveness up to 3 times. Peter had doubled that and added 1. Surely Jesus would be pleased with his offer. But Jesus gave an unexpected reply. In Matthew 18:22, he said, "Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. That's 490 times. But Jesus wasn't giving Peter a number to track on a list. He meant that in God's kingdom, forgiveness has no cap. It's not something you measure or count. To make this lesson clear, Jesus told a story, one his listeners would never forget. In Matthew 18:23-35, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. As he began, one servant was brought to him who owed a massive debt, 10,000 talents. Because he couldn't repay it, the king ordered that he, along with his wife, children, and possessions, be sold to recover the loss. The man dropped to his knees and pleaded, "Please be patient with me. I'll repay everything." Moved by compassion, the king cancelled the entire debt and set him free. But as that servant left, he found another servant who owed him a much smaller amount, just 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began choking him, shouting, "Pay me what you owe." The second servant fell to the ground and begged, "Please be patient. I'll pay you back." But the first servant refused. Instead, he had the man thrown into jail until the debt could be paid. When others saw this, they were deeply troubled and told the king everything that happened. The king called the man back in and said, "You wicked servant! I forgave your huge debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have shown the same mercy to your fellow servant?" In anger, the king handed him over to be punished until the full amount was paid. Jesus ended with this warning: This is how my Father in heaven will treat you if you don't forgive your brother from your heart." The crowd instantly felt the weight of the story. 10,000 talents was a number beyond comprehension, worth around 150,000 years of wages for the average worker. It was an unpayable amount. Imagine owing billions of dollars today. In contrast, 100 denarii was more manageable, about 3 months' wages. Still significant, but nothing compared to the other man's debt. The first servant had been forgiven an unimaginable sum, a lifetime's worth of debt wiped clean in a moment. Yet when given the chance to show a small measure of that same grace to someone else, he refused. The king's reaction teaches a vital lesson. Those who receive mercy should give mercy. Those who are forgiven must be willing to forgive. This doesn't mean we earn God's forgiveness by forgiving others. Rather, if we truly understand how deeply we've been forgiven, we can't hold back forgiveness from others. Jesus made it clear, receiving God's grace and sharing that grace go hand in hand. You can't embrace one and ignore the other. As C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive." The story ends with a strong reminder. The unforgiving servant was handed over to be punished. Jesus made a strong point. Anyone who refuses to forgive shouldn't expect to be forgiven by God. Not because God holds grudges, but because someone unwilling to forgive shows they've never truly understood the depth of God's mercy. Now, let's look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. On another day, Jesus was questioned by a religious expert. In Luke 10:25-29, we read that a legal scholar stood up to test him. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to gain eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law say? How do you understand it?" The man answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You've answered well," Jesus said. "Do that, and you'll live." But the man, wanting to make himself look righteous, asked, "And who exactly is my neighbor?" It was a loaded question. At that time, the word neighbor usually referred to fellow Jews, people from the same background and faith. The man hoped Jesus would agree with this narrow view, so he could proudly say, "I already love my neighbor. I love my own people." But Jesus didn't fall into the trap. Instead of defining the word neighbor, he told a story that would flip their expectations upside down. In Luke 10:30-37, Jesus answered with a parable. A man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him, beat him badly, and left him nearly dead. A priest happened to walk by that road, but when he saw the injured man, he crossed to the other side and kept walking. Then a Levite came by. He saw the man too, but he also passed by on the far side. Finally, a Samaritan came along. When he saw the hurt man, he was moved with compassion. He walked over, cleaned and bandaged the man's wounds using oil and wine. Then he placed him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he gave 2 coins to the innkeeper and said, "Please take care of him. If it costs more, I'll pay you back when I return." Jesus then asked, "Which of these 3 was a true neighbor to the man who was attacked?" The legal expert replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said, "Then go and do the same." The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously dangerous, so much so it was called the Way of Blood. It dropped nearly 1,000 meters over just 27 kilometers and was full of sharp turns where thieves could hide. Jesus' listeners could vividly imagine this scene. The priest and the Levite were religious leaders, people you'd expect to help someone in need, but they avoided the man. Maybe they were afraid the robbers were still nearby. Maybe they worried about becoming ceremonially unclean by touching someone who might be dead, which would break religious rules. Whatever the reason, They chose not to help. Then came the Samaritan. To fully grasp the weight of this moment, one must understand that Jews and Samaritans deeply despised each other. Their hatred was rooted in centuries of ethnic and religious division. To many Jews, Samaritans were considered spiritually corrupt and unclean, people to avoid at all costs. They were called offensive names, and travelers would take long detours just to stay out of Samaria. Yet it was this very man, a Samaritan, whom Jesus chose as the hero of the story. The Samaritan didn't just stop. He went above and beyond to help. He gently treated the injured man's wounds, using wine to clean and oil to soothe. He lifted him onto his own animal, meaning he walked the rest of the journey himself. He paid for the man's stay at an inn and even promised to cover any future costs. When Jesus asked, "Who was a neighbor to the hurt man?" the legal expert couldn't bring himself to say the Samaritan. Instead, he answered, "The one who showed mercy." The truth was clear, but hard to admit. Through this parable, Jesus redefined what it means to be a neighbor. It isn't about someone being close to me, from my group, or like me. It's about who I choose to help. A neighbor is anyone I show compassion to. Jesus also confronted the audience's prejudices. The hero wasn't the priest or Levite, but someone from a hated group. The message couldn't be clearer. True faith isn't about reputation, rituals, or belonging to the right community. It's about compassion that crosses boundaries, love shown in real, practical ways. "Go and do the same," Jesus told the expert. Knowing the lesson wasn't enough. Real mercy requires action. God's kingdom is filled with people who don't just speak about love, but live it out, even when it challenges social, cultural, or religious norms. Now, let's move to the parable of the lost sheep. On another occasion, Jesus was surrounded by people who had been rejected by society. In Luke 15:1-2, we read, "Tax collectors and known sinners were gathering to hear Jesus speak. But the Pharisees and religious teachers complained, saying, 'This man welcomes sinners and even eats with them.' To them, it made no sense for a religious leader to befriend people with bad reputations. They believed spiritual purity required staying away from such individuals. But Jesus didn't see it that way. In response to their complaints, Jesus told 3 parables, each about something lost and later found. The first was about a lost sheep. In Luke 15:3-7, Jesus said, "Imagine one of you has 100 sheep and notices one is missing. Wouldn't you leave the 99 in open pasture and go search for the one until you find it? And once you find it, you lift it up with joy, place it on your shoulders, and head back home. Then you call your friends and neighbors and say, 'Celebrate with me, I found my lost sheep.'" In the same way, Jesus said, there is more celebration in heaven over one sinner who turns back to God than over 99 people who think they don't need to. To truly understand this story, we must think like those in a shepherding culture. Sheep were highly valuable. They provided meat, wool for clothing, and were even used in religious offerings. Every single sheep counted. On top of that, sheep are fragile animals. One left alone in the wild wouldn't survive for long. It would likely be attacked by predators. In Jesus' story, the shepherd had a flock of 100, a good number. But when he noticed just one was missing, he didn't say, "Well, I still have most of them. One isn't a big loss." No. He made sure the 99 were safe, then set off to find the one that had wandered. Think about the work involved. The shepherd would have to climb hills, walk through rough paths, call out constantly, and check behind every bush and rock. When he finally spotted the sheep, he didn't scold it or make it walk back. Instead, he gently picked it up, laid it across his shoulders, and carried it home himself. He was so full of joy that he had to share it. He invited others to celebrate with him. Then Jesus explained what it all meant. Just as the shepherd rejoices when he finds his sheep, heaven celebrates when even one lost person returns to God. Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, "You criticize me for being with sinners, but I'm doing exactly what God does. I'm going out to bring back those who've wandered." This story reveals something remarkable about God's nature. He isn't a cold, distant judge just waiting to punish mistakes. He's a caring shepherd, searching for those who are lost. He doesn't wait for people to come back on their own. He takes the first step. The religious leaders saw sinners as hopeless cases. God sees them as dearly loved individuals worth saving. They believed God found pleasure in punishment. Jesus showed that God celebrates redemption. There's another key detail here. The shepherd leaves the 99 to look for one. This doesn't mean the others don't matter. It means each person matters deeply to God. In heaven's way of counting, it's 99 to 1, because every single soul matters. That truth must have brought deep comfort to the sinners listening to Jesus. They were probably used to being dismissed, ignored, or looked down upon by religious leaders. But here was Jesus, saying that God is like a shepherd who goes after them, rejoices when he finds them, and gently carries them home. Then Jesus told another story, the parable of the lost coin. Right after the one about the sheep, he shared a similar message, but with important differences. In Luke 15:8-10, Jesus said, "Imagine a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Wouldn't she light a lamp, sweep the whole house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she does, she calls her friends and neighbors and says, 'Celebrate with me. I've found the coin I lost.' In the same way," Jesus said, "the angels of God celebrate every time even one person turns back to him." If the first story was about a man and his sheep, this one was about a woman and her coin. Jesus made sure to include both men and women in his examples, showing that everyone could relate to and understand God's love. A silver coin, or drachma, was worth a full day's wage. For this woman, having 10 meant she had a modest savings, money likely set aside for important needs. Losing one coin meant losing a tenth of all she had. Imagine the setting: a small, dim home with a dirt floor and very little natural light. The coin slips from her hand, rolls into a corner, hides in the dust. She realizes it's missing and immediately begins to search. She lights a lamp, even during the day, to shine light into every shadowy spot. She takes a broom and begins to sweep, not just to clean, but hoping to hear the coin hit something or shift in the dust. Her search is focused, detailed, and persistent. She doesn't give up until she finds it. And when she finally does, her reaction is just like the shepherd's, pure joy. She can't keep it to herself. She invites her friends and neighbors to celebrate with her. It might seem extreme to throw a party over a single coin, but the joy of recovering something lost goes beyond its simple worth. Jesus repeated the same point. Just like that woman's joy, there's celebration in heaven when even one person returns to God. He was challenging the mindset of the Pharisees. While they criticized Jesus for welcoming sinners, the angels were throwing parties in heaven over each one who was found. This second parable deepens the first one. The lost sheep had wandered, like someone who walks away from God by choice. But the lost coin hadn't moved on its own. It was lost unintentionally, maybe because of someone else's carelessness or just life's circumstances. That's like people who drift from God without really realizing it. But in both stories, God doesn't just sit back and wait. He searches. He searches with care, giving personal attention until what's lost is found. There's also an important truth about worth in this story. The coin didn't lose its value just because it was lost. It was still valuable, even hidden in dust and darkness. In the same way, Someone lost in sin or far from God doesn't become worthless. In God's eyes, every life still matters deeply. He continues to seek them, hoping for their return. For anyone feeling lost, this parable brings hope. God hasn't forgotten you. He's still searching, shining light into dark places, sweeping carefully to reach you. And when he does, all of heaven will celebrate. For those who, like the Pharisees, tend to look down on sinners, this story offers a challenge. If God values these people enough to go looking for them, who are we to treat them as less? If heaven rejoices when they are restored, shouldn't we join in that joy? These two parables, the lost sheep and the lost coin, establish a pattern. Something precious is lost. Someone searches with care, it's found, and there's a celebration. That same pattern appears even more powerfully in the next parable Jesus tells, the story of the Prodigal Son. Through all these stories, Jesus clearly revealed what matters most in God's kingdom. Unlimited forgiveness, like the king who forgave a massive debt, a love that crosses boundaries, like the Samaritan who helped a stranger, a relentless search for the lost, as shown by the shepherd and the woman, and a celebration when the lost are found. These aren't just spiritual ideas. Jesus lived them out. He forgave freely, broke through social divisions with love, searched for the outcasts, and celebrated when lives were changed. And he called his followers to do the same, to reflect the mercy of the Father in a world longing for grace. Now let's turn to the next story, perhaps Jesus' most emotional parable, the Prodigal Son. Jesus continued showing the crowds God's heart through relatable, powerful stories. After speaking about a lost sheep and a lost coin, he told a story that touched even deeper, the story of a lost child. In Luke 15:11-32, Jesus said, "The young man was so desperate he wanted to eat the food given to pigs, but no one gave him anything. Then he came to his senses and said, 'My father's workers have food to spare, but I'm dying here. I'll go back and tell my father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be your son. Please take me in as a hired worker.' So he got up and returned home. But while he was still far off, his father saw him, was filled with love, ran to him, hugged him tightly and kissed him. The son began his speech, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son,' the young man said. But before he could say more, the father turned to his servants and said, 'Quick, bring the best robe and dress him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Get the fattened calf and prepare it. Let's throw a feast and celebrate, because my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and now he's been found.' And so the celebration began. Meanwhile, the older son was out working in the field. As he approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He asked one of the servants, 'What's going on?' The servant replied, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he came back safe and sound.' The older brother became furious and refused to join the celebration. So the father came out and begged him to come in. But the older son answered angrily, 'Look, I've served you all these years. I've never disobeyed, yet you never gave me even a small goat to celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who wasted everything with wild living returns, you celebrate him with the best we have.' The father responded, 'My son, you're always with me. Everything I have is already yours.' But we had to rejoice. Your brother was dead and is now alive. He was lost and now is found." This may be Jesus' most well-known parable, and it begins with a shocking request. Asking for an inheritance before the father's death was like saying, "I wish you were gone." It was a deep insult in that culture. Even more surprising, the father agreed without arguing. He allowed his son to choose freely, even knowing the risk. The son sold off his share, likely at a loss, and walked away, hurting the family standing in the community. Far from home, away from watchful eyes, he lived recklessly. Scripture says he wasted his wealth on wild living, an elegant way to describe parties, drinking, and irresponsible choices. Then disaster struck. First, his money ran out. Then a famine hit the land. The once carefree son was now desperate, reduced to begging for work. He ended up feeding pigs, the most impure animal for Jews. To Jesus' audience, nothing was more degrading than a Jew taking care of pigs and longing to eat their food. Then the story says he came to his senses. A turning point. A moment of honesty. He realized his father's servants were living better than he was. So he decided to go home. Not to reclaim his place as a son, but simply to ask for a job. He practiced what to say, word for word. "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Please treat me like one of your servants." These words were honest and showed he truly understood what he had done. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was ready to accept the consequences. But everything changed the moment the father saw him coming home. Notice that he spotted him while he was still far away. That means the father had been watching day after day, hoping for his son's return. And instead of waiting for him to come back in shame, the father ran to him. That's a powerful image. In that culture, older men never ran. It was seen as beneath their dignity. To run, they had to lift their robes, exposing their legs, which was considered shameful. But this father didn't care about appearances or customs. He only cared about reaching his son. The son began the speech he had practiced, but never finished it. Before he could say, "Make me a servant," the father had already called for a celebration. He gave instructions immediately. The best robe, to restore the son's honor and show he belonged. A ring, likely a signet, showing authority and reinstatement into the family. Sandals, for sons and free men, not servants who went barefoot. And the fattened calf, saved for rare special events, meaning the entire village would be invited to the feast. The father announced, "This son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." He didn't just forgive him. He fully welcomed him home and restored everything he had lost. But the story doesn't end there. Jesus added one final twist, the reaction of the older brother. While everyone else celebrated, he stayed outside, angry. Once again, it was the father who went out to meet someone. He pleaded with his older son to come inside, but the son poured out his frustration. "All these years I've worked like a slave for you. You never gave me even a goat to celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours comes back after wasting everything, and you give him the best." Notice how he doesn't say "my brother," but "this son of yours." He couldn't even bring himself to admit the family connection. Even though he had always lived close to the father, his heart was just as distant as his brothers had once been. The father's reply was gentle and full of love. "My son, you've always been with me. Everything I have already belongs to you." The father loved them both deeply. The older son didn't need to earn anything. It was already his. The celebration wasn't about rewards. It was about joy over someone who had returned home. And then Jesus ended the story without finishing it. We never find out whether the older brother went inside or stayed outside. The choice was left open, just like it is for us. It was as if Jesus was directly asking the Pharisees who had criticized him. Remember, this story was told in response to them. What about you? Will you celebrate when the lost are found, or will you stay outside, bitter and unwilling? Now let's look at the parable of the wedding banquet. At another moment, as pressure from religious leaders increased, Jesus told a story to illustrate how Israel had rejected God's invitation and how others would be welcomed into his kingdom. In Matthew 22, 1-14, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who planned a wedding feast for his son. He sent servants to tell the invited guests that the banquet was ready, but they refused to come. Then he sent more messengers saying, 'Tell them everything is prepared. The food is ready, the oxen and cattle have been slaughtered. Come join the celebration.' But they ignored the message and went off, one to his farm, another to his business. Some even attacked the messengers, insulted them, and killed them. The king was furious. He sent his army, punished the murderers, and burned their city. Then he told his servants, 'The banquet is ready, but those I invited didn't deserve it. Go out to the streets and invite everyone you see.' So the servants gathered all they could find, good people and bad, and soon the hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see them, he noticed a man who wasn't dressed in wedding clothes. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how did you get in here without proper attire?' The man had no answer. Then the king ordered, 'Tie him up and throw him outside into darkness, where there will be sorrow and regret.' Jesus concluded, 'Many are invited, but only a few are chosen.'" A royal wedding was the biggest event in that culture, extravagant and filled with honor. The king wanted to give his son the most magnificent celebration possible. Turning down that invitation would be unthinkable. It wasn't just missing a party, it was a public insult. In Middle Eastern tradition, invitations came in two steps. First, guests were invited well in advance, like a modern-day save the date. Then, once everything was ready, servants would go out again and announce that it was time to come. The shocking part of this story is that those invited chose not to come, not because they were busy, but because they simply didn't care. They preferred their farms, their work, their comfort. This would have been seen as deeply disrespectful, not just to the king, but to his son. But the story takes an even darker turn. Some of the invited guests attacked the messengers, beating and killing them. This wasn't just a rejection of the event, it was a rebellion against the king himself. In the story, the king responded with judgment. He sent troops to punish those who had killed his servants. Jesus' audience would have seen the connection, how, throughout history, Israel had rejected and even killed the prophets God had sent. Jerusalem's eventual destruction echoed in this parable. And yet, the banquet wasn't cancelled. The king didn't call off the feast. Instead, he widened the invitation dramatically. "Go out to the streets and invite everyone you see." That was the order. These new guests were people who never imagined they'd be invited to dine at a king's table. Ordinary workers, outcasts, people often ignored or looked down on by society. The story tells us the servants gathered everyone they could find, both good and bad. All were welcomed by this new invitation. But then came a final surprise. One of the guests wasn't dressed properly. At that time, in some traditions, the host would provide special clothing for guests. If that was the case here, then refusing to wear the garment would have been a direct act of disrespect. When asked why he didn't have the right clothing, the man was silent. He had no explanation, no defense. Jesus ended the parable with a mysterious but powerful line, "Many are invited, but few are chosen." God's invitation to his kingdom is wide and generous. It goes out to everyone. But those who accept must do so on the king's terms, not their own. We don't come into the kingdom with conditions or pride. For those who first heard this parable, the message was crystal clear. The religious leaders, those expected to recognize and welcome the Messiah, had rejected him and even attacked his messengers. So now the invitation had gone to others, Gentiles, sinners, people on the edges of society. Those who thought they'd never be included now found themselves guests at the table. Now we turn to another parable, this one about readiness, the story of the 10 virgins. When Jesus spoke about the future and the importance of being prepared for his return, he told a story emphasizing alertness and responsibility. In Matthew 25, 1-13, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like 10 young women who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones brought their lamps but forgot to bring oil. The wise ones, however, carried extra oil in jars along with their lamps. The groom was delayed, and all of them grew tired and fell asleep. At midnight, a voice shouted, 'The groom is arriving, go meet him.' The 10 women woke up and prepared their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out.' But the wise replied, 'We may not have enough for both us and you. Go buy oil for yourselves.' While they were gone to buy more oil, the groom arrived. Those who were ready went in with him to the wedding celebration, and the door was closed. Later, the others returned and said, 'Lord, open the door for us.' But he answered, 'Truly I tell you, I don't know you.' Then Jesus gave this clear warning, 'So stay alert, because you don't know the day or the hour.'" To fully grasp this parable, we need to understand wedding traditions in Palestine during Jesus' time. Marriages followed several steps. First came the engagement. Later, on the wedding night, the groom would go to the bride's home to bring her back with him. Then, with music and dancing, a joyful procession would head to the groom's house, where the banquet would take place, sometimes lasting for days. The 10 virgins in the story were likely friends of the bride, waiting to join that parade once the groom arrived. Since these events often happened at night, they needed lamps or torches for light. Jesus divided them into 2 groups, 5 wise and 5 foolish. What set them apart? The wise ones brought extra oil, prepared in case the wait was long. The foolish ones came with lamps, but no extra oil. When the groom took longer than expected, they all fell asleep, even the wise ones. But Jesus didn't blame them for sleeping. The issue wasn't rest, it was being unprepared for the delay. At midnight, the darkest moment, the call rang out. "The groom is coming." All 10 girls woke up to ready their lamps, but the foolish ones realized their lights were dying. They didn't have enough oil. They turned to the wise ones and asked, "Please share your oil with us." But the reply was no, not out of selfishness, but practicality. If they shared, no one would have enough light to complete the procession. The unprepared girls hurried off to buy oil, though it would have been nearly impossible to find any at that hour. And while they were gone, the groom arrived. Those who were ready joined him, and the door to the feast was shut. When the others returned and knocked, they heard the most painful response. "Truly, I don't know you." Jesus ended the story with a strong reminder. Keep watch, because you don't know when that moment will come. The core message is about being spiritually prepared. Just as the groom came without warning, Jesus would return at a time no one can predict. His followers must always be ready. The oil in the story represents this personal preparation, a living faith, a real connection with God. It's not something you can borrow or receive from someone else. Each person must build it on their own, through trust, obedience, and relationship with God. The parable also teaches that the time to prepare won't last forever. Once the door closes, it's final. There is a point when the waiting ends, and those who are ready will enter, while those who delayed will find the door locked. For those listening to Jesus, the message was urgent. Don't wait to get ready spiritually. The celebration of God's kingdom was approaching, and only those who were truly prepared would be welcomed in. Now let's consider the parable of the invited guests who made excuses. On another occasion, Jesus was dining at the home of a Pharisee leader. During the meal, someone at the table made a comment about how wonderful it would be to eat in God's kingdom. Jesus used the moment to share a parable that revealed who would actually take part in that feast. In Luke 14:15-24 we read, "One of the guests said to Jesus, 'Blessed is the one who gets to eat at the feast in God's kingdom.' Jesus replied with a story. A man was preparing a large dinner and invited many guests. When the banquet was ready, he sent a servant to tell those invited, 'Come now, everything is prepared.' But they all started making excuses. The first said, 'I just bought some land and I need to go see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I'm on my way to test them out. Please excuse me.' A third said, 'I've just gotten married so I can't come.' The servant returned and reported this to his master. The man became angry and told his servant, 'Quick! Go into the streets and alleys and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' The servant later said, 'I've done what you asked, but there's still room.' So the master replied, 'Go even farther, into the country roads, and urge everyone to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, none of those originally invited will get even a taste of my banquet.' This parable is similar to the wedding feast story in Matthew, but with key differences. Here, it's not a king hosting a royal celebration, but an ordinary man organizing a big dinner, something much more relatable to everyday people. Still, just like in the other story, there was a two-step invitation. First, to let people know in advance, and later, to tell them the meal was ready. But the guests' responses were unexpected and disrespectful. Let's look at what they said. "I bought a field and need to go see it." This excuse didn't make sense. Who buys land without seeing it first? And who checks fields at night, which is when banquets were held? Then another said, "I bought 5 pairs of oxen and need to test them." Again, why buy animals without testing them first? And how do you try them out in the dark? Then someone else said, "I just got married so I can't come." At first, this might sound reasonable, but in Jewish law, newlyweds were excused from military or civil duties, not from attending joyful feasts. All of these reasons were clearly made up. The invited guests simply didn't want to come. Their land, business, and personal lives took priority over the host's invitation. Yet the host's reaction was extraordinary. Rather than cancel the event, he opened the doors to completely different people: the poor, the disabled, the blind, and the outcast. These were individuals who never expected such an invitation. They were the ones society often ignored. Even after they filled many seats, there was still room, so the host widened the invitation even further. "Go out to the roads and country lanes and urge others to come." This likely meant inviting travelers, foreigners, and those far outside the original social group. The message was clear. Those who were first invited but rejected the offer would never taste the banquet. Their chance was gone. The feast would still happen, but with an entirely new crowd. For those listening to Jesus, the parable had many layers. The religious leaders, the ones who were supposed to recognize the Messiah first, were making excuses to reject him. As a result, the invitation was being offered to people often excluded: the poor, the sinners, and eventually even non-Jews. This story also confronted the assumption of entitlement. The man at dinner who declared, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in God's kingdom," seemed sure of his own place there. But Jesus revealed that many who expect to be included might actually miss out because of their own choices. The invitation was wide open, but participation depended on the response. Misplaced priorities, property, business, comfort, could cause someone to miss the most important celebration of all. Like the other parables, this one revealed God's heart, a heart eager to fill his house, a heart that invites again and again, a heart that embraces those the world leaves out. Through these 4 parables, the prodigal son, the wedding feast, the 10 virgins, and the guests who made excuses, Jesus painted a powerful picture of God's love. It's a love that seeks out the lost, offers grace generously, rejoices when someone returns, and yet expects a real, honest response. It's a love that welcomes the rejected, but cannot be taken lightly. Now we turn to the parable of the talents. As Jesus neared the end of his earthly mission, he became more focused on teaching his followers how to live as they waited for his return. One of his most important lessons had to do with responsibility, how to handle what God has given us. In Matthew 25:14-30, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man going on a journey. He called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, to another just 1, each according to their ability. Then he left. The servant who had received 5 bags of gold went right away and put the money to use, earning 5 more. In the same way, the one given 2 bags earned 2 more. But the servant who received just 1 bag of gold went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money there. After a long time, the master returned and called the servants to settle accounts. The first servant, who had received 5 talents, came forward. 'Master,' he said, 'you trusted me with 5. Look, I've made 5 more.' The master replied, 'Excellent. You are a trustworthy and loyal servant. Because you were faithful with little, I will now trust you with much more. Come and enjoy your master's joy.' The second servant also came forward. 'Master, you gave me 2 talents. I've gained 2 more.' Again the master said, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were reliable with a small task, and now I'll give you greater responsibility. Come and share in my joy.' Then the third servant approached. 'Master,' he said, 'I knew you were strict, reaping where you haven't planted and collecting where you didn't scatter seed. I was afraid, so I hid your money in the ground. Here, take back what belongs to you.' The master was furious. 'You wicked and lazy servant! If you knew I gather where I didn't sow, then at the very least you should have put my money in the bank. That way I would have earned interest when I returned. Take the 1 talent from him and give it to the servant who has 10. For those who make good use of what they've been given will receive even more. But those who do nothing will lose even what they have. Now throw this useless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be sorrow and regret." To fully understand this parable, it helps to know that a talent in this context was not a skill, but a large sum of money, worth about 20 years of wages for an average laborer. Even 1 talent represented a fortune. 5 was an enormous amount. The master gave different amounts to each servant based on what they could handle. There was no unfairness, only wise judgment. He knew exactly how much each person was capable of managing. And the first 2 servants responded immediately. The passage points out that the first servant acted immediately, putting his master's money to good use. He understood that what he received wasn't meant to be hidden, but used wisely. Both he and the second servant managed to double what they had been given. It was a remarkable return, proof of both diligence and wisdom. The third servant, however, took a completely different approach. Instead of investing what he'd received, he buried it. In Jesus' time, this wouldn't have sounded completely reckless. Burying money was a common way to keep it safe from thieves. But the problem wasn't that he lost it, it was that he did absolutely nothing productive with it. When the master finally returned, he asked for an account of their actions. The first 2 servants proudly presented their gains and were praised with the same words. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been trustworthy with little. Now I'll give you greater responsibility. Come and share in your master's joy." The reward wasn't just more responsibility, but also a deeper relationship. To share in the master's happiness suggested closeness, celebration, and belonging. But the third servant came back with only what he had been given and tried to defend his inaction by accusing the master of being unfair and harsh. The master's reply was stern. "If you believed I was that kind of person," he said, "you should have at least put the money in a bank. That way, I'd have gained interest." He took the talent from that servant and gave it to the one who had 10. The meaning is clear. Using what we're given faithfully leads to greater opportunities. Doing nothing with what we have leads to loss, even of what we thought was secure. Jesus was teaching that God gives each of us different resources, abilities, time, opportunities, not in equal amounts, but according to what we can handle. What matters isn't how much we're given, but what we do with it. That's why the first two servants, though entrusted with different amounts, received the same praise. But fear and insecurity, like the kind shown by the third servant, can hold us back. Often this fear comes from a distorted image of God as harsh or unfair, rather than seeing him as generous and just. For Jesus' listeners, the parable had another urgent layer. Israel had received incredible gifts: God's word, the prophets, and now the Messiah himself. How were they using these blessings? Many, especially the religious elite, were hiding them, misusing them, or keeping them to themselves. Now, let's turn to the parable of the minas. As Jesus drew closer to Jerusalem, many of his followers assumed God's kingdom would appear right away, perhaps expecting Jesus to be crowned on arrival. To correct this idea and explain the time gap between his first and second coming, Jesus told a story that resembled the parable of the talents, though with important differences. In Luke 19:11-27, we read, "While the people were listening, Jesus shared this parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and the crowd thought the kingdom of God was about to appear immediately. Jesus said, 'A man of noble birth traveled to a far-off land to be officially appointed king and then return. Before leaving, he called 10 of his servants and gave each one a mina. "Put this money to good use while I'm gone," he told them. But many of his own people despised him and sent messengers to protest, saying, "We don't want this man to rule over us." Still, he was made king and later returned. Once back, he summoned the servants to see what they had done with the money. The first servant came and said, "Sir, your mina has produced 10 more." The master replied, "Excellent, my good servant. You've been faithful with a small task. Now take charge of 10 cities." The second servant said, "Sir, your mina earned 5 more." His master said, "Then you will govern 5 cities." But another servant came and said, "Sir, here is your mina. I kept it hidden in a cloth. I was afraid of you. You're a strict man. You take what you didn't deposit and reap what you didn't plant." The master answered, "I'll judge you based on your own words, you unfaithful servant. So you knew I was demanding, did you? Why didn't you at least put the money in the bank so I could earn interest?" Then he turned to the others and said, "Take his mina and give it to the one who has 10. "But sir," they objected, "he already has 10. The master replied, "I'm telling you, whoever has will be given more. But the one who has nothing, whatever they do have, will be taken from them. And those enemies of mine who refused my rule, bring them here and execute them in my presence." Although this parable may seem similar to the one about the talents, there are important differences. First, the setting is political. A nobleman travels abroad to receive a crown, while some citizens reject his rule. This would have reminded Jesus' audience of real events, such as when rulers from Herod's family went to Rome to receive authority, often facing local resistance. Second, the master in this story gives each servant the exact same amount, 1 mina, equal to about 3 months' wages. Unlike the talents parable, where each received a different sum based on ability, here everyone starts with the same opportunity. The command is clear: use this money until I return. While the nobleman is away securing his kingship, the servants are to prove their loyalty by putting the money to work. When he returns as king, he evaluates them. The first one earns 10 times what he was given, a 1,000% increase. The first servant, who turned 1 mina into 10, receives praise much like in the parable of the talents. But here, the reward is different. Not just more tasks, but real authority. He's put in charge of 10 cities, reflecting the nobleman's now established kingdom. The second servant brought back 5 times what he received, a 500% return. And he too is rewarded, being given leadership over 5 cities. There's no hint of criticism for producing less than the first. His reward matches his results. The third servant, however, did nothing with what he was given. He simply wrapped the mina in a cloth and hid it, less secure than burying it, and certainly not responsible. Like the servant in the talents parable, he blamed his master, claiming he was too harsh and unfair. The king's reply was firm: I will judge you based on your own words. If he really believed the king was demanding, then putting the money in a bank to earn interest would have been the minimum expected. His fear and inaction were unacceptable. Then the parable ends with a detail not found in the talents story: judgment on those who rejected the nobleman's rule. These citizens who said, "We don't want him to rule," are brought before him and punished. This shows the story isn't just about how people handle responsibility, it's also about allegiance. Jesus' followers would understand the meaning clearly. He was about to leave through death, resurrection, and ascension, but he would return as king. During his absence, his followers were expected to use everything he gave them, the message of the gospel, their skills, their possessions, to advance his mission. Those who did so would be rewarded according to their faithfulness and efforts when he returned to establish his full reign. But there was also a warning: those who rejected his kingship, who resisted his rule, would face judgment when he returned in power. Now let's look at one of Jesus' most puzzling parables, the story of the shrewd manager. At first glance, it appears Jesus is approving dishonest actions, but a closer look reveals a deeper message about wisdom in handling resources. In Luke 16:1-13, Jesus said, "There was a rich man who heard that his manager had been mishandling his wealth. So he called the manager in and said, 'What's this I'm hearing? Give me a full account. You're not going to be my manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What will I do now? I'm losing my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. Wait, I've got an idea. I need people to welcome me into their homes after I'm gone.' So he called in each person who owed his master money. To the first, he asked, 'How much do you owe?' 'About 900 gallons of olive oil,' the man replied. 'Take your bill,' the manager said, "and make it 450. Then he turned to the second debtor. 'And how much do you owe?' he asked. 1,000 bushels of wheat,' the man answered. 'Take your bill,' the manager said, "and make it 800. Surprisingly, the master praised the dishonest manager, not for being unethical, but for being clever. Jesus added, "People in this world are often more strategic in handling their own affairs than the people of light are in handling spiritual ones." Then Jesus said, "Use worldly wealth to make friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal homes." He continued, "Whoever is trustworthy with little will also be trustworthy with much. And whoever is dishonest in small things will also be dishonest in big ones. So if you can't be trusted with material wealth, Who will trust you with true spiritual treasures? And if you're not faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you your own? No one can serve two masters. You'll end up loving one and hating the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The parable begins with a manager who's about to lose his job for mismanaging his employer's resources. Before he's officially fired, he puts a plan in motion. He calls in people who owe his master and cuts their debts, by half in one case, by a fifth in another. Why would he do this? His reasoning is clear, so that when I lose my job, those I helped will welcome me into their homes. He's building goodwill and security for his uncertain future. But then comes the unexpected twist. The master actually praises the manager, not for being dishonest, but for thinking ahead and acting decisively. This seems strange at first, but there are several ways to interpret what the manager did. One possibility is that he gave up his own share or commission on the loans. In that time, managers often added fees for themselves, and he may have been cutting only his portion, not the principal. Another theory is that he was removing unlawful interest, since charging interest was forbidden in Jewish law. Even if the manager truly reduced what was owed to the master, the praise was for his foresight, not for dishonesty. He took quick, bold action to prepare for the future. Jesus then makes a comparison. People who don't know God are often more proactive and resourceful with temporary things than believers are with eternal things. The lesson? Use what you have now, your money, time, influence, to invest in things that last forever. Just as the manager used his master's wealth to create future connections, Jesus' followers are called to use earthly resources to serve others, support God's work, and help those in need. These acts will lead to rewards that outlast anything money can buy. Jesus continued by highlighting a core principle. How we handle small responsibilities reveals how we'll handle greater ones. Anyone who proves reliable with small tasks can also be trusted with more important ones. The way we handle small responsibilities shows what kind of person we are and reveals whether we're ready for greater challenges. Jesus then offers a firm reminder about the danger of split priorities. A servant can't serve two different masters. You can't commit yourself to both God and wealth. While money can be a helpful tool, it becomes dangerous when it takes control. If we start centering our lives around money, it pushes God aside. This parable doesn't praise dishonesty. It pushes Jesus' followers to handle material things wisely and with long-term purpose, just like people in the world often do, but with a focus on eternity rather than selfish gain. Now, let's look at the parable about the workers in the vineyard. This story strongly tests our ideas of what's fair and teaches us about the depth of God's kindness. In Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early one morning to hire people to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them 1 denarius for the whole day and sent them to begin working. Around 9 a.m., he went out again and saw more people waiting in the marketplace, doing nothing. He said to them, "You go and work in my vineyard too, and I'll pay you what's fair." So they left to work. He went out again around noon and again at about 3 p.m. and repeated the same offer. Then around 5 p.m. he found even more people standing there. He asked them, "Why have you been here all day without working?" They answered, "Because no one has hired us." He told them, "You can go and work in my vineyard too." Later that evening, the vineyard owner told his manager, "Call all the workers and give them their pay, starting with those hired last and ending with the ones hired first." The workers who had only started at 5 p.m. came forward and were each given 1 denarius. When the first workers saw this, they expected to receive more than that, but they too received 1 denarius each. After being paid, they started complaining about the owner. "These people only worked for an hour," they said, "but you've paid them the same as us, even though we worked all day in the heat." The owner replied to one of them, "My friend, I didn't treat you unfairly. Didn't you agree to work for 1 denarius? Take your wages and go." "I chose to give the last group the same amount as you. Isn't it my choice to do what I want with my money? Or are you upset because I decided to be generous?" This is why the last will become first, and the first will be last. The story starts with the landowner going out several times to find people to work in his vineyard. In that time period, it was normal for workers to gather in the marketplace early in the morning, hoping someone would hire them. Those who didn't get picked early would stay there, hoping for another chance later in the day. The first group was hired around 6 a.m., the beginning of the workday according to Jewish tradition, and they were promised 1 denarius, which was a typical day's wage and enough to support a household for the day. More groups of workers were hired at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and finally again at 5 p.m., just 1 hour before the end of the day. The first group received a clear agreement, 1 denarius for the day's work. The others, however, were simply told by the owner, "I'll pay you what's fair." They accepted his word without questioning and went to work without knowing the exact pay. When it was time to settle wages, the landowner told his foreman to start paying from the last group hired and move backwards toward the first. This order matters. If those hired earliest had been paid and left before seeing what the others earned, they wouldn't have known and likely wouldn't have complained. But now everyone saw the payment amounts. To everyone's shock, the people who had only worked for 1 hour were paid an entire denarius. Naturally, this raised expectations among those who had worked all day. If 1 hour earned a full day's wage, they thought, then surely we'll get more for working 12 hours. But when they stepped up, they also received just 1 denarius, the exact amount originally promised. Unsurprisingly, they were unhappy and complained. They said they had carried the workload and endured the heat all day long. This phrase highlights both how long they worked and the difficult conditions they faced. The landowner's answer reveals something deeper. He makes 3 main points. First, he reminds them that he kept his word. "Didn't you agree to work for 1 denarius?" he asks. He gave them exactly what they were promised. Second, he defends his freedom to use his money as he chooses. "Isn't it my right to do what I want with my own money?" he says. Finally, he exposes their jealousy. "Are you upset because I decided to be generous?" To those listening to Jesus, this parable would have been unsettling. People tend to think fairness means everyone is rewarded based on how hard or long they work. But God's kingdom follows a different pattern, one built not on earning, but on kindness and grace. The landowner did no wrong. Each worker received what was fair, but he also chose to be extra kind to some, and that generosity is what upset the others. Jesus teaches several powerful lessons through this story. The first is that God's grace isn't based on effort or length of service. Salvation isn't a reward for performance, it's a gift freely given. We don't earn it through years of work or personal struggle. The second lesson is about inclusion. The early followers of Jesus, who were mostly Jewish, may have believed they deserved more than Gentiles who joined later. But in God's kingdom, everyone is welcome, and He can be equally generous to all, no matter when they arrive. The third message highlights a common human weakness: envy. Envy doesn't come from not having something. It comes from seeing someone else receive what we believe they shouldn't have. The first group of workers wasn't upset because they lacked what was promised. A single denarius was a fair wage. What bothered the workers wasn't the amount they got, it was seeing others earn the same with less effort. When Jesus said, "The last will be first and the first will be last," He wasn't promising a full reversal, but rather pointing to fairness and balance. In God's kingdom, our usual views on worth, reward, and status don't always apply. These parables, the talents, the coins, the dishonest manager, and the vineyard laborers, offer a complete picture of what stewardship looks like in the kingdom. God expects us to use whatever He gives us, our gifts and resources, faithfully, like in the talents and coins stories. He also calls for smart and forward-thinking decisions, as seen with the dishonest manager. But in the end, whatever blessing we receive comes from God's kindness, not something we've truly earned, just like in the story of the vineyard workers. Now let's turn to the story about the friend at midnight. The disciples had seen how Jesus spoke to God and were moved by how close He was to Him. One day, after Jesus had finished praying, one of them said, "Lord, show us how to pray." That's when Jesus gave them what we now call the Lord's Prayer, but He went further. To highlight the importance of being persistent in prayer, He told a story about someone making a request at a late hour. In Luke 11:5-13, Jesus said, "Imagine you go to a friend at midnight and say, 'Can you lend me 3 loaves of bread? Someone just arrived after traveling and I have nothing to offer.' And your friend replies, 'Don't bother me. The door is locked and my kids and I are already in bed. I can't get up to help you.' I'm telling you, even if he won't help just because you're friends, your boldness will make him get up and give you whatever you need." So Jesus said, "Ask, and you'll receive. Look, and you'll find. Knock, and the door will open. Everyone who asks receives. Everyone who searches finds. For whoever knocks, the door will be opened. If your child asks for a fish, would you hand him a snake? Or if he wants an egg, would you give him a scorpion? If you, even with your flaws, know how to give your children good things, imagine how much more your Heavenly Father will give the Holy Spirit to those who ask." To understand this story better, we need to picture life at that time. Houses in ancient Palestine were small, often with only one room where the whole family slept on a raised floor. Once everyone was in bed, getting up meant disturbing the entire household. In the parable, the man is surprised by a visitor at night. In Middle Eastern culture, welcoming guests was a serious duty. Not having food to offer would be deeply shameful, but the man has nothing to give his late-night guest. In a moment of urgency, the man heads to a friend's home at midnight, asking for 3 loaves of bread. His friend's reply seems reasonable. "Please don't disturb me. The door is shut, and my children and I are already in bed. I can't get up to help." He's simply trying not to wake the entire family over something that could wait until morning. But Jesus highlights something unexpected. Even if the friend won't help just because they're close, he will eventually get up and give the bread, not out of kindness, but because the man keeps asking without giving up. The word used in the original Greek implies bold, relentless determination, a kind of insistence that won't accept silence as an answer. The man keeps knocking, keeps asking, and eventually gets what he needs, not because of their relationship, but because he refused to quit. Then Jesus explains the point. Ask, and you will receive. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will open. In the original language, these verbs suggest continuous action. It's not about asking once, it's about asking and continuing to ask. Keep searching, keep knocking. The idea is consistency, not just a one-time effort followed by silence. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He moves the lesson from a reluctant friend to a loving father. Which of you, if your child asks for a fish, would hand them a snake? Or, if they ask for an egg, would you give them a scorpion? The point is simple. If flawed human parents, people who make mistakes, still know how to give their children what's good, then imagine how much more your perfect Father in heaven will do for you. He's not like the friend in the story who helps only after being bothered long enough. Jesus is making a comparison. If even someone unwilling finally helps, how much more will a God who loves you respond? This story doesn't suggest we must nag God to get his attention, like he's hesitant to answer. Instead, Jesus is encouraging persistent, faithful prayer, not because God needs persuading, but because we need to grow through the asking. Ongoing prayer changes us. It strengthens our trust, deepens our dependence, and helps us focus on what really matters. The mention that God gives the Holy Spirit to those who ask makes it clear. The greatest gift isn't physical, but spiritual. It's his presence with us, his guidance in our choices, and his strength in our weakness. Now consider another story, the parable of the determined widow and the unfair judge. At a different moment, Jesus wanted to show his followers why they should keep praying and not lose hope. So he told a story about a widow who wouldn't stop demanding justice from a corrupt judge. In Luke 18:1-8, Jesus said, "There was a judge in a town who didn't care about God or people. In the same town, a widow kept coming to him saying, 'Give me justice against the one who wronged me.' For a while the judge ignored her, but eventually he thought to himself, 'I don't care about God or people's opinions, but this widow won't stop bothering me. I'll give her the justice she wants, so she doesn't keep coming and wear me out.' And Jesus said, 'Pay attention to what the corrupt judge said. If he gave in, won't God do right by his people who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay in helping them? I assure you, he'll act fast to bring them justice.' Then Jesus added, 'But when the Son of Man returns, will he find anyone with true faith?' This story shows a powerful contrast between a completely selfish judge and a woman with no power at all. In ancient times, judges held great authority and often faced no consequences for their actions. This one was especially bad. He didn't care about God or others. He had no respect for what was right and no concern about how he was seen by others. On the other side was a widow, someone society saw as weak and easily overlooked. Without a husband, she had no protection or legal voice. In the Bible, widows, orphans, and foreigners are often highlighted as needing extra care and fairness. This widow had someone causing her harm. Maybe someone was stealing from her or refusing to return what was hers. She had no one to fight for her, so she went straight to the judge, again and again, saying, "Give me justice against the person wronging me." At first, he didn't care. She likely had no money to offer, so helping her gained him nothing. But she wouldn't stop. She kept showing up, kept asking, kept demanding that he listen. Eventually, the judge gave in. Not because he cared about what was right, but because she was exhausting him. The Greek expression used here paints a vivid picture. He worried she'd wear him down completely or even embarrass him in public. Her persistence worked. Justice came, not out of kindness, but because she refused to quit. Jesus then pointed out the lesson. If even a judge like that finally acts when someone keeps asking, how much more will a good and loving God answer his children? God isn't cold or slow to respond. He's just and full of compassion. He listens and he acts swiftly for those who belong to him. Persistent prayer isn't about convincing God to care. It's about strengthening our trust in him. It deepens our belief and reminds us to keep holding on. And then Jesus asked a powerful question. When the Son of Man returns, will he find that kind of faith? In other words, will he see people who keep praying and believing, even when answers seem far away? He connects steady, ongoing prayer with true, lasting faith. Continuing to pray, even when it feels like nothing is changing, shows deep trust in God. When we stop praying, it might mean we've lost faith in his kindness or no longer expect an answer. This story has brought hope to many who've faced unfair situations. Like the widow, they didn't give up, even when the odds were against them. Jesus encouraged his followers to keep praying for justice, knowing that God is not like the unjust judge. He wants to act and is ready to respond. Now we move on to the story about the Pharisee and the tax collector. After teaching about the need for persistence in prayer, Jesus turned to the attitude behind prayer. In Luke 18:9-14, we're told that Jesus spoke this next parable to some who felt very sure of their own goodness and looked down on others. He said, "Two men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood alone and prayed, 'God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, wrongdoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all my income.' Meanwhile, the tax collector stood far away. He didn't even lift his eyes toward heaven. Instead, he beat his chest and said, 'God, please show mercy to me. I'm a sinner.' Jesus said it was this man, the tax collector, who left the temple right with God, not the Pharisee. Those who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who lower themselves will be lifted. Luke tells us clearly who Jesus was talking to, those who felt superior and looked down on everyone else. The problem wasn't just pride. It was a pride that led to judging others harshly. The two men in the story couldn't be more different. The Pharisee belonged to a respected religious group known for their strict observance of the law. In society's eyes, Pharisees were seen as very holy and upright. The tax collector, on the other hand, worked for the Roman authorities and was hated for often overcharging people and keeping the extra money. Both men went to pray, but their prayers revealed their hearts. The Pharisee likely stood in a spot where he could be seen. Though his prayer was quiet, it focused entirely on himself. He started by thanking God, which sounds good, but listen to what he's thankful for. I'm not like other people. His gratitude had nothing to do with God's kindness or grace. It was all about his own moral standing. He listed the sins he avoided and the good things he did. It wasn't really a prayer of thanks. It was self-praise disguised as a prayer. He even pointed out the tax collector, saying, "I'm not like him," making his pride even clearer. The Pharisee didn't just think he was better than others in general. He felt superior to the very man standing nearby in prayer. In sharp contrast, the tax collector stood far off, likely near the back of the worship space, fully aware of his faults. He couldn't even raise his eyes toward heaven, a gesture showing deep shame. Instead, he beat his chest, a clear sign of sorrow. His prayer was simple. "God, please have mercy on me, a sinner." That short sentence was the complete opposite of the Pharisee's speech. Brief instead of long, centered on God instead of himself, asking for grace instead of listing good deeds, and showing repentance rather than pride. The tax collector didn't try to measure himself against anyone else. He came before God honestly, admitting who he was, a person in need of mercy. Jesus then gave a surprising conclusion. It was this man, the tax collector, who went home in right standing with God. The word justified is key here. It means being declared righteous or made acceptable before God. The humble man, not the religiously respected one, truly connected with God that day. Jesus ended the parable with a powerful truth. Those who lift themselves up will be brought down, and those who lower themselves will be lifted. This message appears often in Jesus' teaching. In God's kingdom, what the world values is often flipped upside down. Pride gets in the way of truly knowing God, while humility opens the way for His grace. This story isn't about religion being bad or sin being somehow noble. The Pharisee's issue wasn't his devotion, but his pride, his reliance on himself, and his judgment of others. The tax collector's strength wasn't in his failures, but in his honesty and his trust in God's forgiveness. The takeaway for prayer is clear. God isn't moved by how impressive we appear or by a list of good deeds. What touches his heart is a sincere, humble spirit that understands the need for his help. Now let's turn to another parable, this one about serving with the right mindset. Jesus didn't only teach how to pray correctly, he also taught how to serve with the right heart. In Luke 17:7-10, we find one of Jesus' shortest stories, but it carries a strong message about humility and duty. To fully understand it, we need to think about the culture of the time. Servants often worked long days, first doing tasks in the fields or caring for animals, then coming inside to cook and serve the evening meal. Jesus posed a question. If a servant comes in after a long day working outside, would the master say, "Sit down and eat"? Of course not. In that time, it was normal for the servant to keep going, making dinner, serving it, and only afterward taking care of his own needs. The next question continues the idea. Would the master thank the servant for doing only what he was told? In that culture, the answer was clearly no. A master wouldn't feel the need to show gratitude for routine tasks. The servant was simply doing what was expected, nothing more. Jesus used this example to make an unexpected point. The word often translated as unworthy can also mean someone who hasn't done anything out of the ordinary, nothing that would deserve extra praise. At first, this might sound a bit cold. Doesn't God value the things we do for him? Doesn't he see our effort? Absolutely. But that's not what Jesus was addressing here. His focus was on an inner mindset, a tendency many people have to feel like God owes them something for their good behavior. A kind of thinking that says, "Look at everything I've done for you, God. Now I deserve something in return." Jesus was correcting this attitude. He was reminding his followers that whatever we do for God is part of our role. It's not a favor we're doing for him. He is the creator, and we are his creation. He's the master, and we are his servants. Our obedience doesn't put him in our debt. This parable matches the message in the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. That one challenged pride in prayer. This one challenges pride in service. Both call us to come before God with humility, recognizing that we rely on his mercy, not our own goodness. Elsewhere, Jesus clearly shows that God does value faithful service. In the parable of the talents, the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." At first glance, that might seem like a contradiction, but it's not. God's rewards come from his kindness, not because he has to give them. He chooses to bless and affirm, even though he doesn't owe it. The humility Jesus teaches doesn't mean we pretend our work doesn't matter. It simply means keeping the right view of our place before God. We serve not to earn something, but because we're grateful. We don't look to stack up points. We give God the credit for all we do. And this outlook is freeing. When we serve without needing applause, we don't feel crushed when no one notices. We remember that our service is ultimately for God, not people's approval. What truly matters is hearing God say, "Well done." These four parables, the friend at midnight, the widow and the corrupt judge, the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the unworthy servant, together give us a complete view of prayer and service. They teach us to keep going, to trust that God is better than anyone we could compare him to be humble, and to serve without expecting reward. Jesus was preparing his followers to live closely with God, with faith that doesn't quit, hearts that depend on him, and gratitude that gives without needing to be repaid. This is the life that honors God and changes the one who lives it. Next, let's look at the story Jesus told about the rich fool. As Jesus continued his journey, large crowds followed him, eager to hear his words. On one occasion, a man stepped out from the crowd and made a request. "Teacher, tell my brother to divide our inheritance with me." This was a strange thing to ask a spiritual leader, showing that the man was more focused on his wealth than on what Jesus was teaching. Jesus replied with a direct warning found in Luke 12:15. "Be careful. Stay alert and guard yourself from every form of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." To drive the point home, Jesus told a story, a message that still feels incredibly relevant in today's material-driven world. In Luke 12:16-21, Jesus said, "A rich man's land produced a huge crop. He thought, 'What should I do? I don't have space to store all this.' Then he said, 'Here's my plan. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll store all my grain and goods there. I'll say to myself, you've got more than enough saved up for years. Relax, eat, drink, and enjoy life.' But God said, 'You fool! Tonight your life will be taken from you. Then who will get everything you've saved?' That's what happens to those who store up wealth for themselves but are not rich toward God. This man wasn't portrayed as wicked in the usual sense. There's no mention of theft, dishonesty, or cruelty. He was simply a successful farmer whose land produced far more than expected. The issue wasn't how he earned his wealth, it was how he thought about it. Look at his reaction. "What will I do? I don't have room for all this." His first thought was how to keep it all to himself. He never paused to thank God, never thought about those in need, and didn't consider using his surplus to help others. He was only focused on his own comfort. Even more telling is how he speaks to himself. "You've got plenty stored up for years. Relax, eat, and enjoy yourself." His entire focus is on himself. He speaks only to himself, about himself. No mention of others, not even God. By the world's standards, his plan seemed smart. Work hard, save well, and enjoy life. But the problem was his assumption that he had time. He believed the future was his to control. Then came God's sobering words. "Fool, tonight your life ends. Who will enjoy everything you've saved?" Jesus never explains how the man dies. That's not the point. Maybe the man had a sudden heart attack while planning his new barns, or perhaps he fell ill unexpectedly. Whatever happened, the message is clear. Despite all his careful preparations, he didn't make it to the next morning. And in that moment, all his wealth meant nothing. Jesus wrapped up the story with a powerful lesson. This is what happens to anyone who stores up treasure only for themselves, but isn't rich toward God. He was drawing a clear line between two kinds of wealth, one that fades when life ends, and one that holds value forever. The man wasn't called a fool because he thought ahead, but because he only thought about this life. His mistake wasn't saving, it was hoarding. He didn't prepare for what really matters. He chased security but placed it in the wrong things. Jesus was teaching that real wisdom understands how short life is, how uncertain the future can be, and how important it is to build spiritual riches through values, relationships, and actions that matter beyond this world. This parable doesn't condemn having money. It challenges placing our trust in it. It doesn't say planning is wrong. It warns against planning that leaves out God and forgets others. Jesus is calling us to use whatever we've been given wisely, remembering that we're caretakers, not owners. One day we'll be asked what we did with it. Now, let's look at the parable of the fruitless fig tree. During another moment in his ministry, Jesus addressed a common question of his time. Why do people suffer? Some had come to tell him about a group of Galileans who were killed by Pilate while offering sacrifices. Jesus responded that those victims weren't worse sinners than anyone else. He also mentioned 18 people who died when a tower collapsed in Siloam. They weren't guiltier than others either. Then he gave this warning: "Unless you turn from your ways, you too will perish." To show both the urgency of repentance and the mercy of God, Jesus told a simple but meaningful story. In Luke 13:6-9, he said, "A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard. He came looking for fruit, but found none. So he told the gardener, 'For 3 years I've checked this tree, and still no fruit. Cut it down. Why let it take up good soil?' 'Sir,' the gardener replied, 'let's give it 1 more year. I'll dig around it and add fertilizer. If it bears fruit, great. If not, then we'll remove it.'" In ancient Palestine, fig trees were prized for their sweet, healthy fruit and could bear crops 2 or even 3 times a year. It wasn't unusual to grow them in vineyards using the open space well. In this parable, the landowner had every right to expect fruit. He had waited patiently for 3 years. That was more than enough time. Seeing nothing, his decision was practical: cut it down. Why let it take up good soil? A tree that produces nothing still uses valuable resources: water, nutrients, space, and sunlight that could support plants that do bear fruit. The decision to remove it made practical sense. But the gardener spoke up: "Let's give it another year. I'll loosen the soil and add fertilizer." He offered to put in more effort, breaking up the hard ground so water could reach the roots and feeding the tree to help it grow. He didn't ask for endless time, only 1 more year. A set period to see if the extra care would make a difference. If nothing changed, he agreed it should be cut down. To Jesus' audience, the meaning was clear. In the scriptures, Israel was often symbolized by a vineyard or a fig tree. Like the vineyard owner, God had long been looking for fruit, acts of justice, mercy, and faithfulness from his people. He had shown tremendous patience, but even divine patience has a limit. Jesus, in the role of the gardener, was offering one final opportunity. His ministry represented that special time, an extended moment of grace, giving Israel one last chance to turn back to God and produce the kind of life he desired. For us today, the parable offers powerful spiritual truths. First, God expects results from our lives. We aren't saved just to take up space, but to grow and show change, lives that reflect love, peace, kindness, and other qualities that come from the Spirit. Second, God is incredibly patient. The owner didn't demand immediate results. He returned again and again, waiting and hoping. He gave multiple chances. Third, even though God's grace is generous, it's not endless. A time will come when we're held accountable, when ignored opportunities won't continue forever. And finally, Jesus steps in for us, just as the gardener did, providing grace and help so we can actually grow and become fruitful. He equips us, giving us every tool we need to live with purpose. This parable reminds us not to take God's patience lightly. Every day is a gift, another chance to grow, to change, and to live the way we're called to. Spiritual alertness means knowing that the time to act is now, not later, not someday, but today. Next, we turn to the parable of the 2 foundations. It comes at the end of Jesus' well-known Sermon on the Mount. After sharing deep insights about life in God's kingdom, Jesus closed with a striking picture that underscored the importance of living out his words. In Matthew 7:24-27, he said that a man who hears his teaching but doesn't apply it is like someone building a house on sand. When the rains fell, the rivers rose, and the wind beat against that house, it collapsed completely. Palestine, then and now, is known for sudden downpours that cause flash floods, especially in dry riverbeds that can fill without warning. In the dry season, riverbeds, called wadis, would completely lose their water, making them seem like great spots to build. But when rain fell, especially in the hills, These empty channels could suddenly turn into raging floods, wiping out everything in their way. Jesus once shared a story about two men who each built a house. On the surface, the houses might have looked the same shape, same materials, same design. But the real difference was something no one could see: the foundation, and that detail made all the difference. One man was wise. He planned carefully and thought ahead. He chose to dig down deep until he hit solid rock before starting to build. It was the harder route and took more time, energy, and effort. But when heavy rains came, rivers overflowed, and strong winds blew against the house, it stayed standing because its base was strong. The other man wasn't so careful. He wanted quick results and didn't think much about the future. So, he built his house right on the sand without laying any real foundation. It was faster and easier, and at first everything seemed fine, until the storm rolled in. That same downpour, those same floods, and winds beat against his house just like the first one. But this time, the house couldn't take it. It collapsed, completely destroyed. The meaning behind the story is simple. Listening to what Jesus says but never living by it is like building a home without a good base. It might look good for a while, but when tough times hit, it won't last. Jesus never said storms only hit those who ignore him. In fact, both builders faced the same weather. Rain poured, waters rose, and wind slammed into their houses. Everyone, those who follow Jesus closely and those who don't, go through hard times. The difference is in how they hold up under pressure. A wise person understands that challenges will come, times of struggle, trials, and pain. Being watchful means getting ready before those moments arrive. It means creating a strong base while life still feels calm. What is that base? It's living out what Jesus taught, not just knowing his words, agreeing with them, or being inspired by them, but actually doing them every day. It means turning teachings like the Sermon on the Mount into daily choices and actions, loving those who hurt us, not just saying we believe in love, forgiving others in practice, not just thinking forgiveness is important, prioritizing God's ways in everyday life, not just during worship. This kind of foundation takes time. Just like a strong base for a home needs many hours of digging, spiritual strength comes from steady choices, daily habits, and choosing what's right, even when it's tough or goes against the culture. According to Jesus, what keeps us steady when life gets rough isn't head knowledge, emotional highs, or church attendance. What really matters isn't how often someone attends religious gatherings, but whether their life reflects true obedience to Jesus' teachings. It's not about how much we know, but how we live out that knowledge. This forms the solid base that holds up when life gets tough. Let's now look at the story Jesus told about two sons. In the last days before his death, Jesus faced growing resistance from the religious leaders in Jerusalem. After he arrived in the city to great praise and cleared out the temple, the chief priests and elders challenged his right to speak and act as he did. In response, Jesus shared several parables that exposed their double standards. One of these was a short but sharp story about two sons who each reacted differently when asked to do something. In Matthew 21:28-32, Jesus asked, "What's your opinion?" A man had two sons. He went to the first one and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." The son replied, "I won't." But later he changed his mind and went. The father then asked the second son the same thing. The second son answered, "Yes, of course, sir," but he never went. Jesus then asked, "Which of the two obeyed his father?" They replied, "The first." Then Jesus said, "I tell you the truth. Tax collectors and prostitutes are entering God's kingdom before you. John came to show you how to live rightly, but you didn't believe him. Yet the tax collectors and prostitutes did. And even after seeing that, you still refuse to change and believe. The meaning of the story is clear. A father asks both of his sons to help in the vineyard, a normal and important job in farming life at the time. But their replies couldn't be more different. The first son answers in a harsh way, saying he won't do it. His response shows disrespect and a clear refusal to obey. But something later causes him to change, maybe regret or a sense of duty or realizing he made a mistake. In the end, he does go and work. His actions didn't match his words. He said no, but ended up doing the task. The second son, however, replies kindly and with respect. He says all the right things, polite, willing, and obedient. Anyone listening would assume he was the good example. But he never followed through. Though his words sounded right, his actions proved otherwise. Jesus then asked the clear question, who truly did what the Father wanted? The answer is obvious, the first son. Even though he spoke rudely at first, he followed through with action. The second, though respectful in speech, didn't obey in the end. Jesus then made a striking comparison. The first son represented the outcasts, those seen as obvious sinners like tax collectors and prostitutes. Just like the first son, many people had initially rejected God by the way they lived. But when John the Baptist preached about turning back to God, they listened. They changed direction and started doing what was right. The second son, though, stood for the religious leaders. They knew how to speak in a respectful, spiritual way. They seemed obedient, but their actions didn't follow. When John came and lived out what it meant to follow God's ways, they refused to accept him. Even after watching broken lives being renewed, they still wouldn't change their hearts. Jesus' conclusion was unexpected. Tax collectors and prostitutes were entering God's kingdom ahead of the religious elite. The very people looked down upon by society were taking the lead in what truly mattered. This parable reveals something key about spiritual insight: the contrast between surface-level religion and real obedience. Jesus was showing that God isn't fooled by fancy words, displays of devotion, or external religious acts. What counts is doing what God asks, even if it comes after initial resistance. It also teaches us what genuine repentance looks like. The first son didn't just feel bad or say nice things. He actually changed what he did. Jesus was highlighting that many of the so-called sinners in his time were making real changes in their lives, while the outwardly religious weren't. For people following Jesus today, this parable is a strong reminder to match our actions with our words. Do we tell God yes through our songs, prayers, and declarations, but live in a way that says no? Staying alert in the life of faith means often checking ourselves to see if we truly live by what we claim to believe. And there's hope here too, for anyone who has pushed God away. The first son didn't stay stuck in his first response. He made a new choice, and that's what mattered most in the end. It's never too late to begin following. Jesus ended by pointing out that the leaders had seen people's lives changed by repentance, but still refused to learn from it. True wisdom involves the humility to change course, even if the example comes from those we least expect. These four stories, the wealthy man who stored up goods, the tree without fruit, the builders with two different foundations, and the two sons, give us a complete picture of what it means to live with wisdom and readiness. They teach us not to trust in wealth that won't last, to live fruitfully while there's time, to build life on doing what Jesus taught, and to make sure our behavior lines up with our promises. These are powerful truths for anyone who wants to live wisely in God's way. Now we come to the story of the sheep and the goats. As Jesus neared the end of his time on earth, he spoke more directly about the future, not just his death and rising again, but also his return in glory and the final judgment. One of his clearest teachings about this comes in Matthew 25:31-46, where Jesus describes a powerful scene. When the Son of Man returns in glory with all his angels, he will sit on his majestic throne. Everyone from every nation will be gathered in front of him, and he will begin to divide them, just like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. The sheep will be placed on his right, the goats on his left. Then the king will turn to those on his right and say, "Come, you who are favored by my Father, receive the kingdom that has been waiting for you since the world began. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I had no home, and you invited me in. I didn't have proper clothes, and you gave me some. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in jail, and you came to see me." The good people will respond, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we welcome you as a stranger or give you clothes? When did we visit you in sickness or in prison?" The king will reply, "I tell you the truth. Whenever you helped even the least important person among my people, you were doing it for me." Then he will turn to those on his left and say, "Go away from me, you who are under judgment. You're headed for the eternal fire meant for the devil and his angels. I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me anything to drink. I had no place to stay, and you didn't let me in. I needed clothes, and you gave me nothing. I was ill and locked up, and you didn't come to help me." They'll also ask, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or as a stranger or in need of clothing or sick or in prison and ignore you?" He will answer, "When you failed to care for the least among these, you failed to care for me." And so those people will head toward lasting punishment, but the righteous will move on to eternal life. Jesus paints this powerful scene to describe his return. He uses the title Son of Man, the name he often used for himself, and describes his coming with shining glory, surrounded by angels, seated on a throne as King of all. It's a picture of honor, authority, and final judgment. Before this throne stands all of humanity, people from every time and every corner of the earth. Then comes a great division, compared to a shepherd separating sheep and goats, something everyday and familiar in the culture of ancient Palestine. Though sheep and goats grazed together during the day, they were separated at night since sheep needed more warmth. But what's most striking is how Jesus chooses to separate them. He doesn't mention religious rules, beliefs, or worship practices. Instead, he focuses entirely on real acts of love and kindness shown to people in need. Those who fed the hungry, gave water to the thirsty, welcomed the outsider, provided clothes for those in need, cared for the sick, and visited those in prison were placed on the king's right side. What stands out most is how Jesus connects himself to those who suffer. When he says, "Whatever you did for even the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me," he makes it clear. Kindness shown to the vulnerable is kindness shown directly to him. Jesus identifies so closely with the hurting and the poor that helping them is the same as helping him. On the other side, the people placed on the left, symbolized by the goats, are not labeled as evil or violent. Their wrongdoing was inaction. They saw others in need, but chose to do nothing. They didn't feed the hungry, give a drink to the thirsty, welcome strangers, offer clothes, or visit the lonely, just as the righteous were surprised to learn they had served Jesus. These others are shocked to hear they had actually ignored him. The final verdict is serious. Some are welcomed into everlasting life. Others face eternal separation. There's no appeal, no second chance. The story closes with a clear message. The way we live now carries eternal weight. For Jesus' original listeners, this story challenged everything they expected. Many believed that strict rituals, religious rules, or being born into a certain community would guarantee God's approval. But Jesus shifts the focus toward love in action, especially toward those in need. This teaching isn't saying people can earn salvation by doing good deeds. Jesus' broader message throughout the Gospels makes clear that real faith transforms people, and this inner change shows up in their actions. Acts of mercy don't earn eternal life, but they are proof that the heart has been changed. The lesson is direct. Loving God and loving others are completely connected. Jesus had already taught that these were the two greatest commands. Now he shows that caring for others is how we show love to God. We can't claim to truly love God if we ignore those he cares about. This parable has inspired many acts of kindness across the centuries. It has led to the founding of hospitals, shelters, food pantries, and countless outreach efforts throughout Christian history. Even today, this story pushes Jesus' followers to see his presence in every person in need and to serve with that mindset, knowing that in doing so, they're serving Jesus himself. Now we move to another of Jesus' powerful parables, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. This is one of his clearest pictures of life beyond death and how our choices now shape our future forever. In Luke 16:19-31, Jesus tells of a rich man who wore expensive clothing and enjoyed luxury every day. Just outside his gate lay a beggar named Lazarus, sick and covered in sores, longing to eat scraps from the rich man's table. But instead of receiving help, he was left to suffer, and even the dogs came to lick his wounds. In time, the poor man died, and angels carried him to Abraham's side. The wealthy man also died and was buried. While suffering in Hades, the place of the dead, the rich man looked up and saw Abraham far off, with Lazarus by his side. He cried out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Please send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm in terrible pain in this fire." But Abraham answered, "My son, remember that during your life you enjoyed many good things, while Lazarus lived in hardship. Now he is here being comforted, and you are the one in distress. Also, there's a great divide between us that no one can cross. No one from here can reach you, and no one from your side can come to us." The rich man replied, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my home. I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so they won't end up in this place of suffering." But Abraham said, "They already have the writings of Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he pleaded, "but if someone comes back from the dead, they'll change their ways." Abraham responded, "If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead." This parable paints a vivid contrast between 2 men. One is wealthy, dressed in rich fabrics, purple, a royal color, and fine linen, usually worn by priests or nobility. He lives every day in luxury and ease. The other is Lazarus, a sick and helpless beggar who lies at the rich man's gate, unable to move on his own. It's important to notice something. The poor man is given a name, Lazarus, which means God has helped. But the rich man remains nameless. That's a meaningful reversal, since the powerful are usually remembered by name, while the poor are often forgotten. But in Jesus' story, the roles are flipped. Lazarus was in desperate condition. He hoped to eat even a few scraps falling from the rich man's table, not a feast, just leftovers. But even those were denied to him. Instead of care from people, he only received attention from stray dogs that licked his sores, a deeply shameful image in Jewish culture, where dogs were considered unclean. Then the scene shifts suddenly. Both men die. Lazarus is carried by angels to Abraham's side, a picture of honor and peace in the life to come. The rich man ends up in Hades, experiencing torment. The following conversation is revealing. During his life, the rich man had ignored Lazarus completely, even though he passed by him daily. Now he knows who Lazarus is and calls him by name, but still treats him like a servant, asking him to bring water. Abraham's reply is clear. Their roles are now reversed. The man who once had everything now has nothing, while Lazarus, who had nothing, is now comforted. And the distance between them can't be crossed. Realizing he can't change his own fate, the rich man starts thinking of his 5 brothers, likely living as he did, focused on themselves, blind to the needs around them. The rich man pleads for Lazarus to be sent back to warn his family. Abraham answers that they already have everything they need in the writings of Moses and the prophets, scripture, which clearly teaches the responsibility to care for those in need. Still, the rich man insists that a miracle, like someone returning from the dead, would have a stronger impact. He says, "If someone comes back to life and speaks to them, they'll turn from their ways." Abraham gives a powerful answer. If they won't listen to the teachings already given, even a person rising from the dead won't change their minds. This final reply offers deep insight into the heart of unbelief. The issue often isn't a lack of proof, it's the unwillingness to accept what's already been revealed. Though the story paints a vivid image of the afterlife, Jesus wasn't trying to map out heaven and hell. Instead, he was using familiar ideas to teach eternal truths about how our current decisions shape our forever future. The problem wasn't simply that the man had wealth. It was his failure to respond to the need right in front of him. He had everything he could ever want, yet no concern for the suffering just beyond his gate. He had more than enough, but never extended mercy. Jesus is teaching that how we treat those in need shows our true heart toward God. If we turn away from the suffering of people God deeply loves, especially when we have the means to help, it reveals a heart untouched by God's grace. This parable also warns us not to assume we'll always have time to change. A moment comes when second chances end and the consequences become final. The deep divide between the two men symbolizes that reality. Finally, Jesus makes it clear that God's word already offers all the guidance we need. If we ignore that, even a miracle won't sway us. That's a powerful reflection on human nature. Real faith isn't always about seeing something dramatic, but about responding to what we already know. Now let's turn to another story Jesus told, the parable of the wicked tenants. During the last days of his public ministry, Jesus shared several parables that directly challenged the religious leaders of his day. One of the boldest was about tenant farmers who rejected the landowner's son. In Matthew 21:33-46, Jesus began, "Here's another story. A man owned a vineyard. He built a wall around it, dug a winepress, and put up a watchtower. Then he rented it to some tenants and went away for a time. When it was time to gather the harvest, he sent his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the tenants grabbed the servants. One they beat, one they killed, and another they stoned. Then he sent more servants, more than before, but the tenants treated them the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them. They'll surely respect my son, the owner thought. But when the tenants saw him coming, they said among themselves, 'This is the rightful heir. If we kill him, we can take everything for ourselves.' So they grabbed him, dragged him out of the vineyard, and murdered him. Then Jesus asked, 'When the owner of the vineyard returns, what do you think he'll do to those tenants?' The crowd replied, 'He'll destroy those wicked people and rent the vineyard to others who will give him what is owed when harvest comes.' Jesus then said, 'Haven't you ever read the scriptures? The The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's amazing in our eyes. That's why I'm telling you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who stumbles on this stone will be broken, but anyone it falls on will be crushed. When the leading priests and religious scholars heard Jesus tell this story, they realized he was talking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they held back because the crowd believed he was a prophet. This parable is full of meaning that would have been obvious to Jesus' audience. The vineyard was a familiar symbol of Israel, often used in the scriptures. In Isaiah chapter 5, for example, God is shown as the one who planted a vineyard, expecting it to yield good fruit, only to be disappointed. In Jesus' version, the landowner did everything right. He planted the vineyard, fenced it for protection, dug out a place to press grapes, and built a tower to watch over it. This symbolizes how God carefully prepared Israel, giving them his law, a homeland, and all they needed to live faithfully. The tenants represent Israel's leaders, especially those in charge of spiritual matters. They had been trusted to care for God's people and live in a way that showed justice, mercy, and faith. The servants the owner sends are the prophets, God's messengers throughout history who were often ignored, abused, or killed. Finally, as an act of deep trust and love, the landowner sends his own son. He believes they will at least honor him. This clearly points to Jesus himself, coming after all the prophets. But the tenants, rather than respecting him, recognize who he is and kill him anyway, hoping to take control. This is one of the most intense parts of the parable. Jesus suggests that the leaders weren't simply unaware of who he was. They had an idea of his identity and still chose to reject him deliberately. Jesus then asked what the owner should do, and it was the religious leaders who answered. Without realizing it, they passed judgment on themselves, saying the owner should punish the wicked tenants and give the vineyard to others who would do what's right. Jesus then quoted a psalm. The stone the builders ignored has become the most important one. That verse was a direct reference to himself. The one they rejected would become the foundation of something entirely new. Jesus makes a bold statement. Although he would be rejected, that rejection wouldn't be the end. Instead, God would turn it into something incredible, the very starting point of something new. Jesus speaks plainly. God's kingdom will be taken from you and given to others who will produce its harvest. He was foretelling that because Israel's leaders rejected the Messiah, the message of the kingdom would spread beyond Israel, to include the Gentiles. Then comes a serious warning. Anyone who stumbles over this stone will be shattered, and anyone it falls on will be completely crushed. Jesus was making it clear that rejecting the one God had sent, the Messiah, would bring terrible consequences. According to Luke, the religious leaders immediately understood what Jesus meant. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard the parable, they realized it was directed at them. But instead of turning their hearts and repenting, they began looking for a way to arrest Jesus. In doing so, they were actually proving his point. They were plotting to do exactly what the tenants in the story had done to the son. This parable carries many layers of meaning. Historically, it pointed to what was about to happen. Jesus would be rejected, condemned outside the city, just like the son thrown out of the vineyard, and then crucified. It also pointed to the coming judgment on Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, and the Gospels spread to all nations. Theologically, it shows God's incredible patience, sending messenger after messenger before finally sending his Son. And it shows the tragic depth of human resistance, even when faced with the fullest display of divine love. For believers today, this parable reminds us that we now hold the responsibility once given to those tenants. We are the new caretakers of the vineyard. So the real question becomes, are we producing the kind of fruit the owner is looking for? Now let's move to the parable of the net. Among his many teachings about the kingdom of heaven, Jesus told a short but powerful story about fishing and the final separation of good from evil. In Matthew 13:47-50, he said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net thrown into the sea that gathers all kinds of fish. When it's full, the fishermen pull it to shore, sit down, and sort through the catch, keeping the good fish in baskets and throwing the bad ones away. That's how it will be at the end of the world. Angels will come and separate the evil from the righteous, sending the wicked into a blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth." Like many of Jesus' stories, this one uses a familiar scene from daily life. Fishing was central to the region around the Sea of Galilee, also called Lake Gennesaret. Many of Jesus' first followers, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, were fishermen. The net in this parable wasn't a small one. It was a massive dragnet thrown in a wide arc or stretched between two boats. When pulled in, it gathered everything in its path, good and bad fish alike, clean and unclean by Jewish standards. Sorting the fish wasn't optional, it had to be done. The good fish needed to be quickly preserved, while the ones that couldn't be eaten were thrown away. This sorting process was a normal part of fishing. Jesus uses this familiar scene to teach a deeper truth about the final judgment. Just as the net gathers all kinds of fish, the kingdom of heaven, in its current form, draws all types of people. Among them are both sincere believers and pretenders, faithful followers and deceivers, just like in another story Jesus told about wheat growing alongside weeds. But this separation doesn't happen immediately. It comes at the end of the age, not gradually throughout history. This pattern appears often in Jesus' teachings on judgment. The moment of separation is not constant. It happens once, at the end. And it's not people who make this call. It's the angels who carry out God's will. Jesus warned many times about the danger of judging others too soon, trying to sort people before the right time. That role belongs to God alone. The words Jesus uses to describe the fate of the wicked are intense. He speaks of a fiery furnace where there will be deep sorrow and regret, symbolized by weeping and grinding of teeth. This parable closely mirrors the one about the wheat and weeds. Both describe a present reality where good and bad exist together. Both focus on waiting for the right moment, and both reveal the serious consequences of being rejected in the end. The main idea is crystal clear. A day will come when every person who has ever lived will face God's judgment. Those who were truly changed by His grace will be treasured, while those who lived in ongoing rebellion will be separated for punishment. But this story, like others about the final judgment, wasn't told to spark curiosity about future events. It was meant to shape how we live today. Knowing that judgment is coming should lead us to stay alert, examine our hearts, and keep pressing forward in faith. In this specific parable, Jesus doesn't clearly list the requirements for being counted among the good or the wicked. But when you look at His teachings as a whole, the message becomes clear. It's not just about looking good on the outside, it's about an inner change that produces real results. Faith in action, love that can be seen, and daily obedience. These four parables, the sheep and the goats, the rich man and Lazarus, the wicked tenants and the fishing net, together give us a complete and sobering picture of the final judgment. They teach us that everyone will one day give an account of how they lived, that how we treat others, especially the most vulnerable, matters deeply, that rejecting God's Son leads to serious consequences, and that in the end, there will be a final, unchangeable separation between those who followed God and those who did not. These stories continue to speak through the ages, reminding us that the choices we make, the way we live, and how we treat others truly matter, both now and forever. While these parables speak honestly about judgment, they also reveal the heart of a loving God who gives us warning after warning, chance after chance, and makes his standards clear. They are not random rules, but calls to love him through real, tangible care for the people around us. And with that, we've arrived at the end of our journey through Jesus' parables. Simple stories with profound meaning that have transformed lives for over 2,000 years. In each one, we saw how Jesus took everyday moments and turned them into windows revealing the deeper reality of God's kingdom, how we relate to him and how we relate to each other. From the scattered seeds landing on different kinds of soil to the final division between the sheep and the goats, Jesus shared lessons that still reach into the core of our hearts. He showed us the limitless love of our Father. He invited us to show mercy, to forgive, to care wisely for what we've been given. He taught us to never give up in prayer, warned us to walk with spiritual awareness, and reminded us that every one of us will one day stand before God and give an account for how we lived. If any of these parables touched something in you, if you felt God stirring your heart through one of these messages, don't keep that to yourself. These truths are like that treasure hidden in the ground, or the rare pearl Jesus spoke about. They're too valuable not to share. If this video has encouraged or inspired you, imagine how many others could be impacted by it too. So I want to personally invite you to click the subscribe button so you don't miss any future content like this. Tap the like button to help others discover these teachings. Share this video with someone who might need these words today. Friends, family, or even someone you've just met. Drop a comment below telling us which parable spoke to your heart the most, or which one you'd like to explore more deeply in an upcoming video. Your support helps us continue to spread God's word in a clear, accessible way for people everywhere. Together, we can help many more people hear and understand the powerful truths Jesus shared. Thank you for walking with us through this journey. May these parables stay with you, not just as memorable stories, but as seeds planted in the good soil of your heart, growing into a life filled with love, faith, and purpose. Until next time, may God bless you and your family abundantly.